Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 114 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin and Fia. How are you guys doing?
Doing pretty good.
I'm doing good.
Yeah. How are you?
Me, I am very tired, because since the last time we had a podcast, I got to see my good buddy Gavin.
Sure did.
We went and helped run a local leadership seminar for high school sophomores, which was quite a bit of fun. And then the weekend after that, I was in a bachelor party in Las Vegas, which was every bit as exciting as you might guess. I got in just this past night at 1 a.m.
Wow.
And so I'm beat.
Oh, geez.
Yes, but it was worth it in every way, and I am thrilled I was able to go.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I on top of the leadership seminar that Mike and I both volunteer at, and Fia when she has a chance.
Yeah.
Fia.
Year. Next year. Catch me at Obi, 2024. Year.
Absolutely. I did a second one of those where I'm semi in charge. And boy, Mike, the more time I'm spending with 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds lately, which isn't a lot, to be clear. But man, the more I have to give a shout out to teachers, especially right now, because the kids are struggling.
Oh no!
It is
just
it's wild.
The post-COVID social interactions are interesting.
I mean, you have that as a problem. You also just have, like, the older that we get, like, 15-year-olds are still 15, but we get a year older every year. And the connection that we once had goes away, and you have to consistently reinvent yourself if you're going to be hanging around kids, either with a youth leadership seminar like we do, or even as a teacher. So yeah, it's thank you, buddy. It's nice to have that acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. But I guess with that, we'll get into some of our regular podcast things. So, Fia, do you want us to do a little housekeeping?
Of course. As you know, don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to. And to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Give us feedback. We always really appreciate that. And let us know if you have any future topics you would like to hear. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, be sure to fill out the guest form, and all of this stuff can be found below in the show notes. And in terms of next episode, what do we got going on?
Well, next episode, I will be in California. Liz and I are taking a trip. She is pet sitting for one of her family friends, and as payment for pet sitting for about 2 weeks, they paid for her plane ticket. So she's flying out and staying there the whole time. And we made a deal that if she went to this past weekend's Hobie, which is an organization that Mike and I and Fia all met at and volunteer at, that if she went to this one, that I would come with her.
What a deal.
Yes, what a deal. I get help at my thing and also get a trip to California. So, yes, for a couple weeks I'll be in California, just hanging out, visiting with Liz's family and stuff. But that will be over next episode. So, we are still TBD on the topic. We're going to figure out whether it's going to be me, or because it's an episode that ends in 5, whether it's going to be, in this case, Mike doing the episode. So, when we know next episode, you'll know next episode. But yeah, so exciting stuff. Summer's always a fun time.
Definitely.
Awesome. With the house being kept, Mike, what's today in history?
So I forgot about today in history until we had started recording. So I found this out in the time since we started recording. No worry, I got one though.
Oh, nice.
I want to let everybody know it was close. We almost lost it. But on today, so this episode is coming out June 21st. June 21st, 3 years ago, 2020. And I said that some of you cringed, but don't worry, we're all good. It's not one of those 2020
I don't know where this is going, buddy.
It's the kind of thing that I found that was like, this is good enough. In 2020, Kurt Cobain's guitar from the MTV Unplugged set for any Nirvana fans out there. The guitar that he played there, it sold for $6 million, I believe, at an auction. And I don't know if either of you two are Nirvana fans or anything, but the Nirvana MTV Unplugged performance is just one of the best concerts in music history.
Wow.
I wouldn't call myself a fan per se. I'm a Nirvana enjoyer. I couldn't really name like any of their albums or anything, but when a Nirvana song comes on, I enjoy it.
I can respect that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's definitely for everybody, but the Unplugged performance, it's a different side. Because it's not the electric guitars and the distorted voice and everything. Right. Like it is, it's a different kind of performance, and it just shows how good those guys all were. They were incredible. So, and that guitar 3 years ago today sold for $6 million.
Wow.
Which is rather nuts. So that is today in history. I believe we have one thing left to do before we get started with the episode. Fia, what's up in the swamps?
Although, real quick, if I could interlude.
Sure.
We're actually recording this also on Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, y'all.
Yeah.
Yes, happy Juneteenth.
So, only in the last handful of years has it become actually a well-known sort of a thing. I think I had slightly heard of it before 2020, but not in a serious way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just wanted to give a shout out. Happy Juneteenth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good one, Gavin. And
so bring us down to the swamp, Fia.
Yeah, down in the swamp today, I would like to talk to you about another benthic or bottom-dwelling organism of the ocean. And this is going to be the clamworm. Alida succinia is the scientific name.
I gotta say, I kind of hate when there are names of other animals in the common name of an animal.
Yeah, and it is not really it's not really relevant at all. They're not associated with clams. I don't really know why they're called that, but Alida succinia. It is a type of polychaete, which is just a fancy way of saying generally a marine worm. These guys live on the bottom floor of the ocean or estuaries, and they like mud or rocky or oyster reefs, but they do swim up to the surface to reproduce. So, kind of weird life history thing.
Yeah.
They can get up to... Oh, I don't know. I didn't dig that deep, but I would assume it's to maybe do some sort of spawning event, but I would definitely have to look into that a little bit more. But anyway, they can get up to almost 8 inches long, which is big for a worm, I would say.
Yeah.
They eat other worms, algae, detritus, diatoms, and also oyster larvae. Remember that for a second. They are a prey item to fishes and birds. And yes, fishes is a correct term to say about multiple species of fish.
Sure is.
And then finally, circling back to that oyster larvae, fun fact, I recently read an article that showed that these worms significantly decrease the amount of oyster larvae on reefs, I guess. They're just really loving to eat those oyster larvae.
So is that the free floating larvae before they start to grow their shell and settle?
Right. So oysters, they reproduce by throwing all of their gametes out into the water, and before they decide to become an oyster, they're just floating around. They're floating around in the water as a larvae, trying to search for the right place and time to sit on something hard and then stay there forever.
Yeah.
It's a big decision that I don't think they have the cognitive ability to make those very hard choices, but they're doing it.
Yeah, they sure are.
But yeah, that's the clamworm for you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Fia. And also, lastly, something I forgot to do last episode before we got started was just to say Happy Pride. Happy Pride Month, everybody.
Happy Pride Month.
Yeah. So, looking at our analytics, I guess Spotify has an option to identify as non-binary, which is cool. And for all of our all-time listens on Spotify, they come from 10% of all of them are from people that identified as non-binary, which I thought was pretty neat.
Woo.
Yeah, so shout out to all of our friends and family and listeners in the LGBTQ plus community. It's a real hard time for y'all at the moment.
Yeah.
So just know that this podcast is a place for y'all to be. You know, we accept all people here. So
everybody love everybody.
Exactly. One of our Hobie mottos. Cool. So on to the topic for today, which, if you have not read the title, is the Great Oxidation Event. So everybody just take a deep breath. Just that's what we're talking about today. So, off the top of your head, either of you, give or take, how much oxygen is there in the atmosphere? Like, as a percentage?
I think like 20... Know. Oops, sorry.
No, go ahead. What do you think it is for you?
I feel like 20% is my guess.
I thought it was, I thought it was like 21%, and nitrogen was like 78%, and there's like 1% of other stuff. But that's my guess, is 21%.
That is absolutely correct. Yes. 21%.
Great job, Mike.
I was going to say, yes. I mean, I assumed you figured that at least one of us was going to bungle that one, Gavin. So, ha to you, I guess.
Yeah.
No, good job, y'all. So, just as a little bit of a forewarning, this episode is going to contain some chemistry. I am not a chemist, so I will do my best. And both of you, please interrupt me with any questions if something doesn't make sense.
Okay.
So, when you take that deep breath in of that 21% oxygen, you do that to absorb oxygen from the atmosphere into your bloodstream to circulate around your body, because you need it to turn your food into energy that you use for all the different life things that you do. That is why we use oxygen, is because that plus the food that we eat, that's how we create energy.
True.
And this is the case for pretty much, with an asterisk, all multicellular life. There are some examples of things like fungi or like colonial protozoans, things like that are multicellular but don't quite use oxygen in that same way. But for the most part, pretty much all complex multicellular life uses oxygen in this way. And it uses oxygen to turn food into energy. That's just the general math formula there. And when I say oxygen for the rest of this episode, I am meaning O2. So that is two oxygen atoms bonded together.
And that's different from other oxygens?
Yeah, so for example, ozone, if you've heard of, like the ozone layer, ozone is 3 oxygens together. Or it is, under current Earth conditions, to my knowledge, it is pretty much impossible for a single oxygen atom to just exist for more than like a millisecond.
Yeah.
But just to keep that in your brain, it is the 2 oxygen molecules. That becomes kind of important for the chemistry stuff we're going to talk about a bit later.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
However, even though I said pretty much all multicellular life does this, not all life does it, though. There are many, many different types of things that do not use oxygen in this way. In your basic biology in high school, if you took like a semester of biology in college, if you went to college, you might have heard the terms aerobic and anaerobic bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Aerobic bacteria are the ones that use oxygen in this way. Oxygen plus food equals energy. Anaerobic bacteria use various other things. For example, some of them use methane, some of them use carbon dioxide, some use hydrogen, some even use like radiation, which is weird. But for the first roughly billion years, with a B, of life existing on Earth, these anaerobic bacteria, so the non-oxygen ones, were the only things living on the planet.
Wow. Because?
Well, we'll talk about it.
All right.
We'll see.
All right.
We're going deep in time in this episode. This is going to be sort of the farthest back that we probably will realistically ever talk about, unless we end up doing an episode about the history of life, or like the origin of life.
Yes.
But this is, at least up to this point, the farthest back in time that we will have gone on the podcast.
Cool.
So let's sort of paint this picture of early Earth, and just as a general reminder for how we talk about, long ago times. The geologic time scale is broken down into eons at the largest scale, and then eras, and then periods, and then stages, which are all smaller chunks of one another. The first eon in Earth's history is called the Hadean, and it lasted from about 4.6 to about 4 billion years ago. So this is the very beginning of Earth history. Mm-hmm. And it is named the Hadean after the Greek god Hades, because at the time the planet was effectively hell.
That's a good one.
Why do you say that?
Well, particularly at the beginning, there were constant asteroid impacts, including a collision with a Mars-sized planet that then ended up becoming the moon.
Whoa.
At the beginning, there was basically no solid land, only molten rock flowing around the surface, but by the beginning, so by around 4.14 billion years ago, somewhere around there, we had solid rock continents and oceans. However, that doesn't mean that it was at all a nice place to be. The atmosphere was about 27 times denser than our current atmosphere, which just feels weird. That means that, things would have 27 times the wind resistance that they do today, effectively. And most of that was due to it being made up of different things than our current atmosphere is today. They share that they were both mainly made up out of nitrogen. However, back then there was much more carbon dioxide, hydrogen, methane, and water vapor in the atmosphere. And also, it was extraordinarily hot because of all that carbon dioxide and methane. Surface air temperatures around this time were well over 500 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's pretty hot.
Surface temperatures were over that much?
Yes.
And there was no life on land at this point, correct?
Oh, no. Okay. At this point, it's debatable whether there was even life at all at this point. And also, the first question I had was, wait, how could there be oceans if the surface was 500 degrees?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
But because the atmosphere was so dense, if you put a container of water under pressure, you can get it to a higher temperature without it evaporating. Yeah.
So essentially the Earth is like a bottle.
A pressure cooker.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And so there was just a smidge of oxygen in the atmosphere, which was about 0.0021%, or give or take 21 parts per million. So for every million molecules in the atmosphere, only 21 were oxygen.
That's not enough.
Not enough.
Not for us.
Not for pretty much anything that would be around today, but we'll talk about that. These oceans also would have been extremely acidic thanks to all of that carbon dioxide, which, carbon dioxide dissolved in water makes carbonic acid, which is why, you hear about acid rain and things. That's what that is. And life was hypothetically possible toward the end, but to my knowledge, we have no evidence for it during the Hadean.
Makes sense.
After the Hadean comes the Archean eon from 4 to 2.5 billion years ago, and it's here where we have the first for sure record of life, starting at around 3.5 billion years ago. The first fossils that we have absolute concrete evidence for are called stromatolites. We've talked about those a whole bunch on the podcast. they are mats of bacteria that would form sort of layered dome-like structures as they grow. So it's not like fossilized bacteria per se. They basically cause minerals to form as they grow just through their different metabolic processes. And, when these minerals grow, they need to sort of get up above them to not just be suffocated. So they form a layer, move up, form a layer, move up. So it makes these layered domes that technically can form from non-life processes, but it's generally assumed if you find one that it was formed by life. However, just as a general note, no one is really under the assumption that the first stromatolites that we see are the first life forms. Life had likely been around since pretty much right at the end of the Hadean is sort of what it's kind of thought. So around 300 to 500 million years before these stromatolites were formed. So life had been cooking for a good bit by the time we actually find it in the rocks. Mm-hmm. And life in general is probably doing pretty well in these early oceans, living off of chemicals in the water, and then also likely eating each other as well. Just as there are, predatory bacteria today, like amoebas and things that, basically reach out and grab other bacteria and suck it into its own cell. It's generally assumed that this was happening back then as well. Sometime around this 3.5 to 3.4 billion years ago mark, a major event happened in the history of life on Earth. And that is the evolution of the first photosynthetic organisms.
Wow.
Very important. If you think of basically all life on Earth today is dependent on photosynthesis. There are some exceptions, but not a lot. And today, the photosynthesis that comes to most people's mind is the one that most of the things that we interact with day to day do, which is they absorb carbon dioxide and give off oxygen when exposed to sunlight. That is the typical kind of photosynthesis. Mm-hmm. However, that's not the actual definition of photosynthesis. That is just one specific type of photosynthesis. It is entirely possible to use sunlight to produce sugar, which is the actual goal of photosynthesis. Oxygen is just a waste product of photosynthesis. It's not the end goal. It's entirely possible to create sunlight or to use sunlight to create sugar without also making oxygen. And that is what those first photosynthesizers were doing. So the first oxygenic photosynthesizers appear sometime around this a little bit after, but probably somewhere in the 3.2 to 3.4 billion years ago, which I know is kind of hard to wrap your head around that it's, these numbers are very large.
Yeah.
Was there any, or are there any organisms around today that still have that, non-oxygenated photosynthesis at all? Or
I'm going to hesitate to say no.
I feel like
I'd be shocked if they, I'd be shocked if there weren't some. But I couldn't name a specific example or even what any of their chemistry with how they do it. That's how uncommon they are. I would be surprised if there weren't some in just some weird environments like super saline environments, like incredibly salty water that might do it. But short of that, I don't think so.
Okay.
So, at this point, roughly in the 3.2 to 3.4 billion years ago, we're going to fast forward a bit. Because that was the first key point to hit, was photosynthesis being a thing. Instead of just using energy from chemicals, you're actually using energy from the sun at around this time. Going to fast forward to about 2.5 billion years ago. And we are now in the earliest part of the next eon, the Proterozoic. And in that close to a billion years that we just skipped through,
just a casual billion.
There's been, just casual. billion here, billion there. What's the difference? Just call me Elon. So in that billion years, there's been some things happening, as you could hopefully assume. That's a long time for nothing to have happened. And so to understand this, here's where the chemistry kind of comes in. So, in basic chemistry, just like we talked about basic biology a little bit ago, you might have heard the words oxidation and reduction, or you might have heard of redox reactions.
Oh, yeah. This
is a very fundamental part of chemistry. So if you've taken a chemistry class, you probably have talked about these at least a bit. And this is very important to the rest of this episode, so I will try to explain it as simply as I can. Please let me know if you have questions. So, atoms are made up of three main parts. There are the protons and neutrons that make up the nucleus of the atom, and electrons in a cloud around the nucleus. When a chemical reaction happens, it is very, very common for electrons to get moved around from one atom to another. Oxidation is when an atom loses electrons, and reduction is when it gains electrons. And for the record, it's called oxidation because oxygen is really, really good at gaining electrons from other atoms. It's really, really good at it. And will very easily steal electrons from other atoms whenever they are involved in a chemical reaction.
They're electron thieves.
Exactly. And this is, like I said, a major foundational part of chemistry, and it basically dictates what types of chemical reactions can even happen in the world. For example, today, if you were to drop a cast iron pan out into the ocean, it would rust very quickly because the ocean is highly oxidizing. That is what rust is. It is oxidized iron. Mm-hmm. Up to this point in Earth's history, however, from its creation up until we're about 2.5 billion years ago, so from those first billion, or almost 2 billion years, Earth's oceans were weakly reducing, meaning that in general, atoms were unlikely to lose their electrons to the environment around them. So if you dropped a cast iron pan into the oceans during the Archean eon, it wouldn't really change. It would not rust.
Cool.
And, right, so this might not sound like a major thing, like, oh no, thank God, my pan will not be rusty. However, this is a major difference in just how chemistry can happen in the world. This completely changed what kinds of chemical reactions can take place at all, which affects life in a big way, because as much as life tries to isolate itself from the environment, it is still affected by the environment around it. And even changes the molecules and different nutrients and things that life can find around it, because nature might not be doing the same chemical reactions that we think of it doing today. Mm-hmm. And so, again, throughout those billion years that we've just skipped through, oxygen-producing bacteria were around, but relatively rare. They gained some footholds in a couple of isolated pockets in some specific environmental conditions. And it is around this time, in the mid, 2 billion years ago or so. So 2.8 to 2.5 billion years ago, where we start to see the first evidence for oxygen becoming more abundant. And this is sort of where this chemistry gets applied. This evidence comes in the form of what are called banded iron formations, which we have some in our geology department here at the university I work at. They're very pretty. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a section of rock that is made up of bands of, literally just lines of rock, where there are some that are red, that are made up of sort of a red, rusty-colored chert. with oxidized iron in it. That's why it's red and why it's rusty. And then the other band is sort of the metallic iron that is not rusty, made up of minerals like magnetite and hematite that are very iron rich. And it sort of alternates back and forth between the shiny dark colored layers and the rusty red colored layers. And so this is the first evidence that we see that, hey, there must have been oxygen around because we have this rusting happen.
Mm-hmm. We're just kind of inferring because that rust exists?
Right.
Okay.
And here's sort of the, thought, how we think they form. In geology, it's hard to find some different things that, like, we find in, like, old rocks, but we can't see them happening today. And banded iron formations are kind of like that because our oceans are so oxidizing. It's very hard to try and find a place where these kinds of things are forming, unlike, like sandstones. You can just go to a beach and see those forming. So we had to sort of rack our brains to figure out how these things formed. And so this is kind of what the thought process is. So there would be a layer in the ocean of these photosynthetic bacteria up in the at the surface of the oceans, and they would produce a bunch of oxygen, which then binds to all this iron that is dissolved in the ocean. Just like the ocean has a ton of different elements and stuff dissolved in it, at this time there was a bunch of iron in the oceans. And so this oxygen from these bacteria would bind with it. However, oxidized iron is not dissolvable, so it turns into a crystal and then drops to the bottom. And that's how you get the rusty red colored layers. However, go ahead, Fia.
I was just going to say this is a lot of chemistry.
Yes. So, bacteria produce oxygen, binds to the iron falls out of the water to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
However, to these bacteria, even the ones producing it, oxygen is highly toxic.
Oh?
Yeah.
Go on.
So, they would produce oxygen that would then kill them, and then there would not be things producing oxygen, which is how you get the non-rusty bands. But it wouldn't kill all of them, so eventually they would, regain numbers enough to be producing more red bands, but then, poison themselves again, and then so on and so forth until you get this alternating, basically like algal blooms, but leaving behind these red layers when they bloom.
Wow.
Yeah. And just to elaborate on the oxygen being toxic thing, because we think, as I mentioned earlier, almost everything today needs oxygen.
Right.
But if you didn't evolve in that context, why would you need it?
Why?
And so I sort of thought of a good sort of analogy to this. And it all kind of just comes down to that, like I mentioned earlier, oxygen is not the end goal for things that do photosynthesis. The sugar is. Oxygen is the waste product. And it's similar to how when we animals do respiration, the goal isn't to make carbon dioxide, that's just a side effect. And if we make too much carbon dioxide in our bodies, we die. It's a very similar thing.
Yeah.
And however, in these oceans, that wouldn't be a huge problem because the chemistry of the oceans basically absorbs all of that oxygen like immediately by that iron. That iron, for the most part, absorbs all that oxygen immediately and turns it rusty red and makes it fall out of the water. But if there's enough of these bacteria around, they can sort of choke themselves out. So for the time between 2.8 and 2.5 billion years ago, this kind of thing happened all the time. There would be wisps of oxygen added to the oceans that would then form these banded iron formations, and then they'd kind of snuff themselves out. And it's important to note that while this was all happening in the oceans, this was not affecting the atmosphere basically at all. The atmosphere was basically still at more or less 21 parts per million oxygen. And that's because if you are in the water, you just release all your waste into the water.
Yeah.
It doesn't go into the atmosphere. Plants release things into the atmosphere because they're in the atmosphere.
So, how do we get there then? How do we get oxygen into the atmosphere?
Yeah, we'll get there.
Oh, sorry, I'm ahead of it.
Yeah, no spoilers. So, it is around this 2.5 billion years ago when the tide sort of starts to turn. The first thing that I thought about when I was reading about how the banded iron formations are formed, where it's like they just end up poisoning themselves from their own oxygen, I'm like, well, that makes a pretty obvious evolutionary selection pressure for these photosynthesizers that make oxygen to adapt to be more tolerant of oxygen. That seems like an obvious, selection pressure that would be put on them.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
And as they became more oxygen tolerant, they would no longer poison themselves, and then regularly, as the oxygen levels of available oxygen for chemistry in the oceans increased because of this. However, like I said, this didn't really translate to actual oxygen being available for life to use yet, though. Even life in the oceans, because all that oxygen, because it is so eager to steal all those electrons, just gets sucked up by like things like the iron and other sinks in the ocean, other just loose ions and things that oxygen bonds with. So in order for the oceans to fill up with oxygen molecules, those O2 just floating around, it needs to go through all of this iron and other metals dissolved in the ocean first.
Okay.
And this next part gets a little confusing to me when I was doing the research, but it was kind of clear that pretty much everybody agreed that the rate of oxidation wasn't constant and that it came in sort of pulses over the course of a few 100 million years.
That seems wild without you telling me why that is.
Well, and the reasons were kind of all over the place. From what I gathered, it seemed like it could be for a variety of reasons. Things like a lack of nutrients that this specific type of photosynthesis needs. So today, there's constantly a ton of erosion thanks to things like plants on the continents, which breaks up rocks and puts it into rivers, which then takes it to the ocean, which provides constant nutrients into the ocean. There wasn't that happening on land, so there wasn't as much nutrients in the ocean to use for photosynthesis. So there was just sort of a limiting factor of nutrients. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that because these other non-oxygen producing photosynthesizers were still around, they were competing with the ones that did produce oxygen and sort of, keeping them, holding them back from their potential. So there's, again, a number of hypotheses for why it didn't just sort of snowball itself immediately, but not kind of a consensus on one particular hypothesis or another.
Okay.
But everyone agrees that it took somewhere in the ballpark of 300 million years for it to sort of really get snowballing, which is why I said earlier that 2.8 to 2.5 billion years, that time difference is about 300 million years. And then at that 2.5 is when it hit that tipping point. Enough of the oxygen sinks in the ocean had been used up, and then free oxygen, those O2 molecules, were able to finally just exist in the ocean, allowing life to use them if it were able. And this changed it from a slightly reducing ocean to an oxidizing one like we have today.
And remind me what oxidizing means?
Yeah, so oxidizing means that, the oxygen, those O2 molecules, will steal electrons from other things.
Okay.
It basically just sort of puts an Uno reverse card on what kind of chemistry can happen in the ocean, period.
Jeez.
And needless to say, this was actually a really, really bad day for life on Earth at the time.
Oh, no.
Because they were used to the world before, and that world no longer existed, I assume.
Exactly. And not only was their chemistry now totally different, oxygen was still very toxic to most of this life at the time. If you Google Great Oxidation Event, you'll also see it called things like the oxygen catastrophe, the oxygen crisis, or, for some reason, the oxygen holocaust, if you're weird. And this was a rabbit hole I went down, and now you have to as well. That apparently from one book by a couple of weirdos named Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan, who called it that in a textbook they wrote in 1968. Coincidentally, those are the wife and son of Carl Sagan, the famed astrophysicist. Yeah, don't call things holocausts. It's never a good look for anybody.
Yeah.
So, anyway, the general vibe is that life was real bad for most things on Earth at the time. And it's really hard to say with concrete numbers, but this was likely one of the worst mass extinctions in Earth history.
But
I mean, it's everywhere all at once.
Exactly.
Well, I'm confused because I thought that there wasn't really much life going on to begin with.
So that's also a really good question. There was not as wide of a variety. There were not animals or plants yet. But if you were to take, I mean, today's not a great example, but you're a marine scientist. If you take just like a teaspoon of ocean water, all the microorganisms living in it, that was the case back then as well. But they were just doing things like, functioning off of the chemistry of the water instead of like a more complex food chain. It was basically a food chain made up of just autotrophs, whether they be photoautotrophs using sunlight or chemical or chemoautotrophs using different chemicals, and then amoeba-like things that were eating those.
Okay, so like,
again, yeah, go ahead.
Like the number of different kinds of organisms wasn't as much, but like the raw numbers of actual like things was still pretty high.
Right.
Okay, got it.
And it's really hard to quantify this because we don't, in past times when we've talked about mass extinctions, we've talked about, this percent of species went extinct globally. We can't really do that because we don't have any named species from this long ago.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been a couple studies on, biomass estimates and how they changed around this time. And it seems like about 80% of all life died around through this span of time.
Got it. That's a lot.
Yeah. And now that this has happened, how does that leave Earth when you, like I said, just Uno reverse card the entire chemistry of Earth? First, it allows, and I'm saying first as a geologist, it allows new types of minerals to be created. Geology at its core is just a lot of chemistry. Each type of mineral has a pretty specific set of chemical conditions that it needs to be in for it to form. For example, a lot of those iron minerals that I mentioned earlier, like magnetite, needs to be in a reducing environment or oxygen will rust it. And so, of the roughly 4,500 mineral, we call them mineral species today, about 2,500 of them cannot form in reducing conditions. So this more than doubled the amount of minerals that could exist on Earth. Secondly, as we were talking about earlier with the atmosphere, when the ocean got to its sort of carrying capacity of oxygen, it started to just passively diffuse out through the atmosphere. Just as, us putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, burning fossil fuels today affects the ocean, by the carbon dioxide just dissolving into the water, the opposite can also happen. Things can go from the water into the atmosphere as well.
So it's like reverse ocean acidification.
Kind of, yeah.
Cool.
And so once at least the shallow oceans, maybe not the deepest parts of the oceans were full of oxygen, it would start diffusing into the atmosphere with some pretty immediate and powerful effects. The atmosphere at this time, as I mentioned before, had a lot of methane in it, and methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. Methane breaks down into carbon dioxide when it's combined with oxygen. And while carbon dioxide is still a greenhouse gas, it is a much less potent one. So if you just immediately suck out a bunch of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, global temperatures crash really hard.
Like they get colder, you mean?
Yes, and in fact, in episode 51, we had an entire episode about Snowball Earth. And this is one of those times. This event triggered the Huronian glaciation, where there were miles thick glaciers near the equator.
Wow.
Yeah. It really rubber banded from, it had cooled a bit since I had mentioned where it was multiple hundreds of degrees surface temperature. It was not quite that warm before this, but it was still very warm relative to today. And then immediately temperatures just drop so fast and then basically freeze the earth, nearly solid.
Does anything survive?
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the things that we had talked about in that episode 51. So if you want to go back, listeners, and take a listen, it's likely that there was a band around the equator that wasn't totally solid, or it's also hypothesized that it was more of a slush ball than a totally compact snowball. But needless to say, as we are life here talking through the internet, life did survive this massive glaciation, but
yeah, spoiler.
Spoilers. This near global cover of ice lasted about 300 million years.
Long time.
And lastly, in my opinion, the biggest thing that this did was it opened the door for life to sort of innovate. Very shortly after this, it is thought that that's when the first endosymbionts happened. The endosymbiont hypothesis explains how eukaryotes, which is most multicellular things, got their mitochondria and chloroplasts. So if you also remember some basic biology, the mitochondria is
the powerhouse of the cell.
Yeah.
Thank you. So mitochondria are very special organelles in cells because they have an extra layer sort of around them. Your cell has sort of the cell membrane, and then the mitochondria has its own cell membrane. However, the mitochondrial cell membrane is basically the exact same as a bacterial cell membrane, not an animal cell membrane. So, endosymbiont hypothesis, which, we've effectively, there's so much evidence for it that it's hard to think of another way that this would have happened. That way back around this time, a single-celled organism tried to just swallow up another one, but instead of digesting it, it just kept it as like a little internal pet.
Yep.
And that's how mitochondria happened. And then over time, mitochondria would evolve as well and become strictly for doing energy production and things in cells. And that same thing is almost exactly what happened with plants and how plants got their chloroplasts, which are their organelles that do photosynthesis. Basically the exact same scenario. And so it is around this time where this is thought to have happened for the very first time.
That's huge.
Yeah, that is what enables all, multicellular life to happen today.
Yeah.
It also, this one's a little more complex if you have not taken, general bio. It also necessitated life evolving more complex processes and mechanisms inside their cells, particularly for DNA repair. Oxygen damages DNA.
Oh.
Even still today, our cells get damaged by, or our DNA gets damaged by oxygen. But it was also around this time where cells developed ways to A, fix their DNA better and repair it so it's not just broken, and B, do things like create a nucleus of the cell to sort of shield it. That's where all the DNA is, and that sort of shields it from oxygen as much as possible.
That's pretty innovative.
When you say damage, like what do you mean by like cells become damaged?
It just can sort of change some of the chemistry of your DNA by stealing electrons.
Well, okay. I mean, that sounds like, cancer almost.
Honestly, kind of, yeah. Because, if you've heard antioxidants thrown around as sort of buzzwords in like health foods and things, or like skin creams and stuff like that, that's what those are supposed to be doing. In things like skin, I don't really think it does anything because skin cells are dead. But eating foods with antioxidants in them, like I know one of my favorite fruits is pomegranate, and they're pretty high in antioxidants. Those help protect your DNA from general damages, but things like being damaged by oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is just all of this, these new challenges for these early organisms to try and solve basically just open the door to creating just in general more complex systems and chemical systems inside cells for them to later, that would end up being adapted into the very complex things that we see cells doing today.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. And then, just as a round off, it would be about 1.5 billion years before more complex multicellular like animal life would start to evolve. But this is basically what allowed that to happen at all. This oxygenation of the mainly the oceans, and then as a result the atmosphere.
Right.
And that is pretty much all I've got. Like I said, this was a bit of a dense episode. There's a lot of heavy concepts on here.
Mm-hmm.
But to just sort of think about the world in a deep time perspective is something that you get very used to as a geologist. But even going back this far was a little hard for me to wrap my head around. And then especially some of the chemistry stuff. I am by no means a chemist.
If you are a chemist, reach out to us. We'd love to have you on the show.
Yes, absolutely. And if you had any questions, any non-chemist listeners, please, comment them on the YouTube channel or tag us or add us on Twitter if you still use that hellscape of a platform. But that is pretty much all I got. Do you guys have any last notes?
I'm glad this happened because oxygen's cool.
Yeah.
Oxygen sure is cool.
And great job explaining some of the chemistry stuff. I feel like it would have been more difficult without you.
Oh, thanks.
That has been episode 114 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. That was Gavin. I'm Mike. Fia was over there as well. We will see all of you guys in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.